I thought I owned my land, until I saw drilling machines tearing up my backyard, without my permission. Turns out my neighbors, led by the HOA, had secretly approved 7 illegal wells on my property. But what they didn't expect? I had a cement mixer, and a plan that would expose everything. I was halfway through my morning coffee when I spotted it. A massive drilling machine crawling across the edge of my backyard like a metal beast from a nightmare. Men in hard hats were casually marking spots in my field with neon orange spray paint, as if it were some kind of construction zone. At first, I thought maybe they had the wrong address. Maybe it was a mistake. But then one of them glanced up, completely unfazed, and said, "We're here to drill a well." Just like that. No apology, no explanation, and absolutely no permission. That was the moment my quiet life on the 5-acre plot I inherited from my grandfather turned into something out of a legal thriller. I wasn't part of the HOA next door. Never had been. Never planned to be. My property existed long before Pine Grove Estates was built, with its perfectly trimmed lawns and overzealous rulebooks. So why were there contractors stomping all over my land, treating it like their own? The answer, as it turns out, was buried under decades of paperwork, fine print, and one single document: an old easement agreement. Margaret Wilson, the poised, calculating president of the HOA, pulled up in her shiny SUV later that day, like a queen arriving to address a peasant. With her designer sunglasses and a clipboard clutched like a scepter, she stepped onto my property with the confidence of someone who's used to getting her way. She smiled, that fake, tight-lipped HOA smile, and handed me a copy of the document. It had my grandfather's signature at the bottom. According to her, it gave the HOA permission to drill one emergency well during a declared water crisis. But as I looked around at the numerous orange spray marks scattered across my land, clearly outlining the sites of multiple wells, it was obvious this wasn't an emergency. It was a takeover. What really got under my skin was her tone. "You're welcome to contact our legal team," she said sweetly, already turning on her heel. Just like that, she was gone, leaving behind the roar of machinery, the dust of turned-up soil, and a sinking feeling in my stomach that something much bigger was happening. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The drilling didn't stop. They'd brought floodlights and were working through the night like they were racing against a clock. But what clock? And why the urgency if this was just a harmless emergency well? Something didn't add up. The next morning, I made some calls to the county water authority, to old friends, even to my lawyer. And what I started uncovering made my blood run cold. There was no official water emergency. The county hadn't issued any conservation orders that would justify this level of action. Meanwhile, just across the street, sprinklers were watering lush green lawns, and the HOA was proudly announcing plans for a luxury water feature and a new resident lake. This wasn't about water conservation. This was about money. And my land was caught in the middle of it. I didn't know it yet, but this small act of defiance, standing in my own backyard yelling at strangers who didn't care about ownership or boundaries, would spark a battle that would expose corruption, flip power structures, and change not just my life, but the entire community around me. And it all began with the question: why are they drilling wells on my land? I knew something was wrong the moment I drove past the Pine Grove Estates welcome sign and saw the sprinklers dancing in full swing. Grass so green it could be mistaken for AstroTurf. Lawns freshly watered. Maintenance crews refilling the neighborhood pool like there was no such thing as drought. All this, while the HOA claimed a water emergency severe enough to justify drilling 7 wells on my land. The fury built in my chest with every passing house. This wasn't a drought. This was a lie. And it was starting to feel personal. The kicker came when I passed a banner near the front gate. "Coming soon, Pine Grove, Luxury Lake, and Water Feature." I slammed on the brakes. My jaw clenched so tight I thought I might crack a tooth. I snapped a photo and drove straight home, fists gripping the wheel, heart pounding. They weren't just trespassing. They weren't just overstepping the easement. They were flat out stealing my water to build a private lake for aesthetics, for show, under the guise of emergency. When I got back to my property, the the scene had escalated. 3 separate drilling teams were now working across my field, tearing through decades-old trees, trenching through my late grandfather's garden, laying down thick pipes like arteries running across a patient in surgery. Only this patient was being butchered. I didn't even have time to yell before a neighbor, Frank Miller, strolled up, arms crossed, watching the commotion like it was a Saturday parade. "Impressive project they've got going, huh?" he said casually, nodding toward the drilling crews. "Do you know what this is?" I asked, hoping against hope that someone in this neighborhood had some sense. "Sure," Frank replied, smirking. "Margaret talked all about it at the last HOA meeting, said they finally got the green light to tap your aquifer for the new lake, said it'll boost property values by at least 15%. Property values. That's what my land was worth to them. Not heritage, not privacy, just numbers on a real estate spreadsheet." Frank chuckled and added, "My wife's on the landscaping committee. They've been planning this for months." Months. That was the moment it hit me like a freight train. The fake emergency. The sudden surge of activity. The strategic use of an old easement clause. It wasn't a coincidence. It was calculated, coordinated, planned, and worst of all, they never thought I'd fight back. I thanked Frank, turned around, and went straight inside to call a lawyer. Attorney James Powell was calm, methodical, and the only person who didn't treat me like I was crazy. "They've clearly overstepped the original easement," he confirmed after reviewing the documents. "One well, and only in an actual emergency. This is a textbook case of easement abuse." "Can I stop them?" I asked, already knowing the answer was going to sting. "Yes," he said, "but it'll take time. We can file for an injunction, but that may take a week or more." A week? By then, who knows how much damage they'd do. James told me to document everything. Take photos, record conversations, log every trespass, and every inch of destruction. So I did. I went outside with my phone and started photographing everything. The rigs, the pipes, the marked trees, the trampled garden. That's when I noticed something odd. The pipelines weren't leading into Pine Grove Estates. They were heading away, across my land and toward the opposite end of the field. I followed the path, and after a quarter mile, found freshly planted survey stakes and a metal sign that made my blood boil. Future site of Lakeview Mall and Entertainment Complex. It wasn't just about fountains or lakes anymore. They were selling my water. To developers. I stood there, alone, heart pounding in my ears, hands trembling as I snapped more photos. I could barely hold the phone steady. They weren't even pretending anymore. This was theft, plain and simple, organized, signed, permitted, and sanctioned by a board that had no legal authority over my property to begin with. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by papers, photos, legal printouts, and HOA newsletters that now read like manifestos of deceit. The HOA had declared war, not on just my property, but on the very concept of ownership. They thought I'd be too small to fight, too quiet to resist. But they forgot one thing. This wasn't just land, it was my grandfather's legacy, and they had just declared war on the wrong person. That night, something changed in me. As I sat alone at my kitchen table, surrounded by photos, permits, legal documents, and maps of my grandfather's land, I stopped feeling like a victim. The anger didn't just boil anymore. It settled into something sharper, more focused. They had taken too much. My garden, my soil, my water, my peace. But what they couldn't take was my right to fight back. It started with one small call to a friend of mine, Mike, who worked in construction. "How fast can you get me a cement mixer?" I asked. There was a pause on the line. "Planning a new patio?" he asked. "Something like that," I replied, already knowing I wouldn't tell him the full truth. Not yet. Before dawn, I had hit up 3 different hardware stores in neighboring towns, paying in cash, picking up bags of quick-set cement. I didn't want anything traced. I didn't want to give them even the smallest lead to stop me. If they thought they could steal from me, I'd make sure they never used a drop of that stolen water. I reread the original easement for the 10th time. It gave them permission to drill one emergency well on my property. Nothing more. It said nothing about retaining continued access, maintenance rights, or the legal use of multiple wells. In fact, it was barely more than a paragraph, buried in legalese my grandfather likely hadn't thought would ever be abused. So I got to work. At 2:00 a.m., under the moonlight, I wheeled the cement mixer toward the first well. The drilling teams had gone home for the night. The security guard they left behind was asleep in his truck, oblivious. I moved like a ghost, my hands steady, my breath slow, and my heart pounding like a war drum. Batch after batch of thick gray cement disappeared into the shaft. To help it set properly and make it even harder to break, I threw in scrap metal, broken pipes, rusted fittings, even a couple of old tire irons. It took hours, but as the sun began to rise, the first well was sealed forever, and nobody knew. The next night, I did it again. Then again the night after that. I moved with precision and discipline, like a soldier on a mission. By the end of the third night, I had sealed 4 wells with reinforced concrete. Their luxury water dreams were slowly turning to stone. The turning point came the morning after the 4th well was filled. I woke up to the sound of furious pounding at my door. Margaret Wilson stood there with 2 men in suits, one her attorney, the other a private investigator, I guessed. "You sabotaged our wells," she snapped, marching into my foyer like it was hers. "Your wells?" I said calmly. "You mean the illegal ones on my land?" One of the men stepped forward. "Mr. Reynolds, this is serious vandalism." "Actually," I interrupted, pulling a folder from the kitchen counter, "what's serious is exceeding the legal easement your HOA was granted. What's serious is drilling 7 wells without permits. And what's really serious is rerouting water for commercial purposes when no drought emergency has been declared." I laid out photos of the luxury mall construction site, photos of tanker trucks pulling water off my land, screenshots of email newsletters sent to Pine Grove residents bragging about the exclusive member-only retreat and new lake. Their faces changed from red with anger to pale with realization. They weren't just facing a stubborn landowner anymore. They were facing a legal reckoning. "And one more thing," I added, locking eyes with Margaret. "I've been recording our conversations, including the one where you admitted that the board reinterpreted the easement clause for multiple access points." The attorney visibly winced. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. She glanced at the investigator, who shifted awkwardly in place. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. Not just frustration, real, sinking dread. "You think this will stop us?" she hissed, but it was hollow now. "No," I said, "but this will." I reached for my phone and dialed James, my lawyer. "We're ready to file," I told him. "They know everything." That same afternoon, James submitted an emergency injunction to stop further activity. He also looped in the County Water Authority and Environmental Protection Agency, forwarding all the evidence we had collected. Photos, videos, emails, and my log of every interaction. By nightfall, the entire town was buzzing. They thought they could bury me in paperwork, but I buried their wells instead. This wasn't just resistance. This was the beginning of justice, and I was just getting started. The moment Margaret Wilson stepped onto my property again, I knew the gloves were off. She wasn't alone this time. Behind her trailed Jason Jenkins, another HOA board member, and 2 unfamiliar men in crisp suits and polished shoes. Lawyers, clearly. Margaret was in full battle mode, sunglasses perched atop her head like a crown, lips pursed with faux authority, as if she still believed she controlled the situation. "You need to stop what you're doing right now," she barked as I stepped out of my garage. "This is sabotage, and you're going to regret it." I didn't flinch. "On the contrary, Margaret, I'm just protecting what's mine." "You filled 6 of the 7 wells with concrete," Jason snapped. "That's over $200,000 in damages. You're going to pay for every cent." "I'm not paying for wells that never should have been there in the first place," I shot back. "Read the easement again. 1 emergency well. That's all your HOA was ever entitled to." Margaret stepped forward, her tone sharp and condescending. You've caused irreparable harm to a community project that benefits hundreds of families. Your selfishness is— This wasn't a community project, I interrupted. This was your backdoor scheme to sell water to commercial developers while lying to your own residents about a fake drought. Don't you dare wrap this in the flag of public service. And the lawyers tried to play peacemakers at first, offering to negotiate a mutually beneficial resolution. They offered hush money, a few $1,000s, and the promise of no further violation notices if I let the last well remain. It was laughable. Let me be clear, I said, stepping closer so they could see I meant every word. There will be no more wells. There will be no more threats. There will be no more abuse of this land. You've underestimated me. And now you're scrambling. Margaret's face turned crimson. She spun around and waved toward the street. Moments later, 2 security trucks rolled in and parked just outside my property. 4 guards in black uniforms stepped out, arms crossed, eyes scanning. "What's this?" I asked. "Site protection," Jason said. "The board has authorized 24-hour security to prevent further destruction of HOA infrastructure." "Nice try," I said, pulling a folded court order from my back pocket. "That infrastructure is on my property. And this," I handed the paper to the nearest guard, "is an injunction from the county court. Effective immediately, all drilling and construction activity is to cease." The guard read it, eyes widening. I think we're done here," he said to the others, who quickly got back in their trucks and drove off without another word. Margaret's jaw tightened. "You think this is over?" "Oh no," I replied, my voice steady, low. "This is just the beginning." Just then, a white county vehicle pulled up. From it stepped a man in a water authority vest, clipboard in hand, followed closely by a local police officer. "Mr. Reynolds?" the man asked. "We've received a formal complaint regarding unauthorized aquifer access. We're here to inspect the site." I nodded. "You're just in time." I led them to the 7th well, the only one I hadn't sealed yet. The inspector's eyes narrowed as he saw the exposed piping, the lack of signage, and the direction of the water lines, not toward Pine Grove Estates, but toward the future mall construction site. "This confirms our suspicions," he said, snapping photos. "They're diverting water illegally to commercial property." The police officer turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, I'm going to need a statement from you and your board members. This appears to be well beyond a civil dispute." "You can't do this," Margaret muttered, shaking her head in disbelief. "You don't know who you're messing with." "No, Margaret," I said, my voice firm. "You don't." A growing group of neighbors had begun to gather at the edge of my property. I recognized them. Folks who'd once avoided eye contact now whispered and nodded in my direction. Some were recording. Others simply watched as the great unraveling of the HOA's facade began. The conflict had boiled over. No more backroom deals, no more polite emails, no more pretending this was about community values. This was raw, exposed, and it was far from finished, because when the people who claim to protect a neighborhood are the ones exploiting it the most, somebody has to draw the line. And that somebody was me. The courtroom buzzed with a hushed tension as people filed into the gallery. Neighbors, journalists, HOA members, environmental officials. The judge's bench stood elevated at the front like a stage set for the final act in a long, bitter war. I sat beside my lawyer, James, hands clenched in my lap, heart pounding with anticipation. Across the room sat Margaret Wilson, flanked by Jason Jenkins and 2 other board members, their lawyer whispering urgently between them. The door slammed as Judge Kendall Watkins entered, her robe flowing behind her. She peered over her glasses, surveying the packed courtroom. "I've read the preliminary filings," she said sternly, "and what I see deeply concerns me." The room fell completely silent. Margaret's lawyer stood first. "Your Honor, this matter has been greatly exaggerated. Our clients acted within the scope of an emergency easement to address a community water need. Mr. Reynolds, unfortunately, reacted with unwarranted hostility." James rose next, his voice steady and sharp. "Your Honor, what my client reacted to was deception, unlawful trespassing, and environmental exploitation." We intend to show that the so-called emergency was fabricated, that the HOA drilled 7 wells on his land without proper authority, and that the water was not for community use but for a commercial development 2 miles away. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I saw Frank Miller, Margaret's neighbor and once supporter, shift uncomfortably in the gallery. Judge Watkins raised an eyebrow. Proceed. James began methodically, laying out the timeline of events, supported by photographs, timestamps, security footage, and the original easement agreement, clearly stating 1 well for emergency use only. Then came the twist. Your Honor, James continued, we also present evidence that water was being transported via unmarked tanker trucks from Mr. Reynolds' property to a construction site listed as the future location of Lakeview Mall. We have video proof and GPS tracking to confirm this route. The so-called emergency water was being sold for profit. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Margaret's face blanched. Judge Watkins slammed her gavel. Order! Next, the County Water Authority official took the stand. Calmly but firmly, he confirmed that no official drought emergency had been declared during the timeline of the drilling. At no point did our office authorize aquifer access on Mr. Reynolds' land, he said, and such access would require permitting regardless of HOA status. The real hammer came when Sarah Jenkins, yes, Jason's own wife, stood up unexpectedly from the crowd, holding a thick folder. Your Honor, may I speak as a citizen and former HOA committee member? The judge nodded. My husband and others were told this was for fountains and water features within the neighborhood, but these blueprints, she held them up for all to see, show something else entirely. Plans for a private retreat for board members with a heated pool, artificial waterfall, and exclusive lake access. All to be supplied by wells drilled on Mr. Reynolds' land. Now the gallery was in chaos. Reporters scrambled to jot notes. People whispered in disbelief. Jason stared at Sarah like he'd never seen her before. And, she added with visible hurt in her voice, Margaret promised certain members financial incentives if they voted in favor. The judge's voice thundered through the room. Silence! Margaret tried to regain control. She stood shakily, pointing at me. This man vandalized community property. He poured cement into the wells. Dozens of thousands of dollars in damages. He's a criminal. Judge Watkins didn't flinch. And yet, he acted in response to multiple violations of his private property rights, including unauthorized drilling and environmental disruption. Then the judge delivered the final blow. After reviewing all presented evidence, she declared, this court finds the HOA in clear violation of the easement agreement and county environmental law. Mr. Reynolds is awarded damages for destruction of property and emotional distress totaling $165,000. Furthermore, all wells must be permanently closed and the land restored. Cheers burst from the gallery, but the judge wasn't done. In addition, based on the presented financial records and blueprints, I'm referring this case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges related to fraud and unauthorized commercial resource exploitation. Margaret's knees gave out slightly, and she clutched the table. Jason buried his face in his hands. The board's lawyer looked like he wanted to vanish through the floor. Outside, a mob of cameras and flashing lights waited. My name was already trending online as the Cement Avenger. I didn't ask for it, but I had become the face of a fight so many others were too afraid to start. And in that courtroom, with truth finally laid bare, the playing field had shifted. The high walls of arrogance built by the HOA had come crumbling down. Not with hammers or lawsuits alone, but with proof, persistence, and the unyielding courage to say enough. And still, as I stood to leave, one thought lingered. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was the start of a reckoning. 3 months after the court ruling, the land that had once echoed with the roar of illegal drilling machines now hummed with laughter, conversation, and the rhythmic crunch of footsteps on soft gravel paths. The sun cast golden light across the open field behind my house. No longer a battleground, but a sanctuary reborn. The former sites of the 7 cemented wells had been transformed into circular garden beds, each surrounded by native wildflowers and adorned with a bronze plaque explaining the story of what had happened. A story of betrayal, but more importantly, one of resilience. I stood at the edge of the new community nature preserve, watching volunteers plant saplings, hang bird feeders, and paint benches. People I once barely knew now waved warmly and called me by name. Dave, from 3 houses down, was helping his teenage son dig post holes for a wooden welcome sign. Ellie, from across the street, handed out lemonade. Even Sarah Jenkins, once caught between her husband and the truth, now stood proudly holding a clipboard as part of the neighborhood's transition committee. "Funny how things turn out," she said, glancing toward the newly constructed information kiosk, proudly bearing a small engraved plaque, "The Reynolds Legacy Preserve, in honor of James Reynolds Sr." My grandfather would have smiled at that. He always believed land was something to care for, not to exploit. The mayor had shown up earlier that day with a golden key to the education center that would soon host workshops about water conservation, native planting, and responsible land use. "Let this be a permanent reminder," he said during the dedication ceremony, "that when one person stands firm in truth, it can spark something much bigger than a victory in court. It can change a culture." But it wasn't just the physical landscape that had changed. The entire neighborhood had shifted. The old HOA board was dissolved after the scandal. In its place, a new charter was written with transparency and fairness at its core. Monthly meetings were now public and well-attended. Neighbors who had once been afraid to speak up now raised their hands confidently, offering ideas, voicing concerns, building together. It was humbling. I never asked to be a symbol. I never expected a story about cementing wells to go viral, or for reporters to call me the homeowner who stopped a corrupt HOA in its tracks. All I wanted was to protect my land. But somehow, in standing up for my corner of the world, others found the strength to stand up for theirs too. I received letters from homeowners across the country, some from people in cities I'd never heard of, thanking me for inspiring them to challenge their own unfair HOAs. One woman from Arizona wrote, "They said I couldn't have a ramp for my disabled mother. Your story gave me the courage to fight back." That made all the sleepless nights and legal meetings worth it. Later that evening, I sat on the porch with a warm cup of tea, watching kids race bikes down the path where water trucks once rumbled. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the garden. It was quiet in a way it hadn't been for a long time. Frank Miller passed by with his dog, stopping at the gate. "You changed this place," he said simply. "For the better." I smiled. We all did. And it was true, because change doesn't come from one person alone. It comes from people choosing not to look away, choosing to listen, to stand, to care. It comes from a community finally realizing that what connects us is stronger than what divides us. That day, I stopped seeing my land as a fence line that separated me from my neighbors, and started seeing it as the bridge that had finally brought us together. In the end, this wasn't just a battle over land or water. It was a story about integrity, about standing up when no one else will, and about the quiet strength it takes to do the right thing, even when you're standing alone. For those of us who've lived long enough to see the world change more times than we can count, one truth remains steady. Character matters. And when that character is rooted in purpose and fairness, it can weather even the fiercest storms. What began as a personal mission to protect my grandfather's legacy became a catalyst for something much larger. It exposed how power, when left unchecked, can corrode the very foundations of a community. But more importantly, it reminded us that justice doesn't always wear a robe or carry a gavel. It lives in the choices we make, the lines we draw, and the courage we show when faced with intimidation. For older generations, especially those who grew up with a strong sense of community, shared values, and personal accountability, this story echoes a familiar lesson. You don't need to be loud to be heard. You just need to be right. And sometimes, doing what's right won't win you popularity or praise. It may even make you a target. But it's the only path that leads to peace. Another lesson is this: even when the system seems broken, it can still be rebuilt. One voice can become many. A single stand can become a movement. When neighbors begin to look out for each other again, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care, real healing begins. And when the rules start to serve people instead of the other way around, something remarkable happens. A community is reborn. For seniors watching this, maybe you've faced something similar, a time when you had to protect what was yours, or when someone tried to silence your voice. Let this be a reminder. It's never too late to stand firm. Your experience, your wisdom, and your stories are the pillars that younger generations need. In a world often rushing ahead, you still hold the map for how to find our way back to compassion, responsibility, and truth. And finally, let us not forget the land itself. This story began with earth and water, things many take for granted. But our environment is not just a backdrop to our lives, it's our inheritance, our duty to protect for those who come after. Preserving it isn't just about policy, it's about heart. So whether you're a homeowner, a grandparent, or just someone who believes in fairness, remember, courage isn't always loud. Sometimes, it sounds like a cement mixer on a quiet morning, sealing shut a path of wrongdoing and laying the foundation for something far more enduring: hope.